Good morning from India and greetings from the Department of Folkloristics and Tribal Studies, Central University of Karnataka. My name is Longshibeni and I'll be the moderator of today's session, and we are in the second day of the 3-day international conference on Indigenous knowledge and climate change, issue, challenges, and coping mechanism. Yet again, we are here with amazing panel. Our speaker, Dr. Sufi Chow from the University of Sydney and Professor Lucy Zehol from the Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. Well, talking about ethnography and research, in the recent times, very rarely we get to see committed researchers spending a considerable amount of time in the field, living with the people, pursuing their issue and writing about them. And in this concern, Sufi Chow is exemplary, and we're very privileged to have her as our speaker today. And she's going to touch upon very pertinent topic with regards to palm plantation. And many of our participants have been really looking forward to it. And I hope they're joining us live right now. If you are, pleased to put your comments and questions in the chat box. We will make it a point to address it in the live session. If not, after the session, we will make it a point to communicate to the speaker, and I hope she will get back to us in due course of time. Coming to our discussant, Professor Lucy, we all know that she's an expert with regards to gender issues, particularly in the Indian context. And I personally am very excited because I must admit that she has been very instrumental in shaping my research career as an academician as well. And I started learning ABCs of research under her guidance. And it's very a mixed feeling for me right now to see her in this platform. And I'm really looking forward to listen to her insights and observation following the talk of our speaker. So with this, a very brief note and introduction, I shall now invite our speaker, Sufi Chow, to deliver her talk.
For that wonderful introduction, Longshibeni, and hello to everyone on YouTube. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to start by acknowledging Gadigal elders, past, present, and emergent, and also acknowledge Gadigal kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. A huge thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today in conversation with Professor Lucy. I'm really deeply honored to be part of this conference, which I can foresee as generating a rich and I would say much needed platform for ideas, experiences, action, and thought as we try to realize, protect, and exalt multi-species becomings in this age of planetary unmaking. So the paper I want to give today draws from almost a decade of research and advocacy that I've conducted with Indigenous Marind peoples in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua, where vast areas of Indigenous lands and forests have been razed and converted to monocrop oil palm plantations in the last decade. In particular, my talk is going to focus on the intersecting forms of social and environmental injustice generated in this era of the Plantationocene. The Plantationocene, as some of you might know, is a concept that has emerged from a long and rich lineage of intellectual thought surrounding monocrop formations, one that was first pioneered by scholars in critical race studies, such as Sylvia Wynter and Catherine McCriddick, and that has more recently been revisited by scholars in the field of multi-species studies and the environmental humanities, such as Donna Haraway and Anna Singh. The Plantationocene as a spatio-temporal formation speaks to the devastating transformation of diverse kinds of human-tended farms, pastures, and forests into extractive and enclosed monocrops that rely on slave labor and other forms of exploited and alienated labor. The Plantationocene today continues with ever greater ferocity in the globalized factory meat production, in monocrop agribusiness, and in the immense substitution of crops like oil palm for multi-species forests and their products. As a key driver of tropical deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and global warming, the Plantationocene is, of course, also a key figurant within broader processes of climatic crisis and collapse. So in exploring the Plantationocene, I want to focus more particularly on Indigenous experiences and visions of justice in the plantation nexus. And in that regard, the paper is trying to make empirical and conceptual contributions to a budding interdisciplinary body of scholarship on the theme of multi-species justice. Now, this concept of multi-species justice was first coined by the feminist science and technology scholar Donna Haraway in an attempt to decolonize justice from dominant Western epistemologies that have traditionally restricted the subject of justice to the human and to the individual. Instead, multi-species justice aims to develop more capacious, inclusive, and expansive concepts and practices of justice that recognize other than human beings as subjects of the law and as objects of harm, from animals and plants to ecosystems and landscapes. As Indigenous scholars have long noted, such concepts and practices of relational, more than human justice have always served as the moral and cultural foundations of Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies of nature. With these Indigenous epistemologies, plants, animals, and elements are often considered as sentient or otherwise animate, kindred beings who deserve to be treated with respect, fairness, and dignity. Here, the well-being of humans is understood to be intrinsically linked to that of the diverse entities that humans become with across place, across time, and across species. Grounding my analysis in the experiences and discourses of Indigenous Marind inhabiting the shadow places of agro-industrial capitalism, this paper asks, how are Indigenous ways of being, becoming, and belonging with other than humans changing as a result of injustices wrought by the intertwined violence of capitalism, conservationism, and colonialism? How does injustice manifest in the context of organisms like native plants and animals that are threatened by techno-capitalism, but also in the context of organisms like oil palm that thrive at the very heart of the agro-industrial nexus? And how can we reconcile justice for non-human beings with justice for marginalized Indigenous peoples who themselves continue to be treated as subhuman, disposable, and killable before the law? So the questions I'm asking and the topics I want to cover draw in large part from a book that is forthcoming with Duke University Press in June next year, which you can find out more about at the website morethanhumanworlds.com. And it also draws from an edited volume on the promise of multi-species justice that is also coming out later in 2022. And I want to mention this second volume because I want to acknowledge the many thinkers with whom this presentation has flourished. So we're traveling now to the upper banks of the River Bian in the province of Merauke, which is located in the Indonesian-controlled province of West Papua in the western half of the island of New Guinea, where this red spot is here. The Upper Bian area of Merauke is home to the Indigenous Marind peoples, who number around 600 households and who depend primarily on hunting, fishing, and gathering for their everyday subsistence. The forest and lands from which Marind derive their subsistence are considered to be animate, sentient entities, populated by myriad other than human organisms who together render place alive, or hidup in Marind. Each Marind clan entertains a particular relationship to particular groups of species and elements whom they call their grandparents or their siblings, and with whom they share common descent from ancestral creator spirits, or Dema. Marinds other than human kin include grasslands, river floodplains, and dense swamp forests. They encompass serpentine rivers, monsoonal rains, and vast wetlands. The liveliness of the landscape arises also from the presence, movements, and interactions between various animals, from migratory birds, waterfowl, and waders, to cassowaries, kangaroos, possums, and crocodiles. Plants, too, participate in the ecocosmology of the forest through their patterns of propagation and senescence, from tall sedge grasses and melaleuca swamp forests to nipa palm clusters and dense sago palm groves. Each of these different entities are considered by Marind to be conscious, autonomous, and agentive. Each participates alongside humans in shaping the landscape through their movements and relationships. Plants and animals grow to support humans by providing them with food and other resources, and in return, humans exercise respect and perform rituals as they encounter plants and animals in the forest, record their stories, hunt, gather, and consume them. Together then, human and other than human life forms produce the landscape as a living repository of relations past and present, a realm of life that is distributed across species lines. Over the last decade, however, the arrival of large-scale oil palm monocrops has radically undermined the intimate and ancestral relations binding Marind to their plant and animal siblings. Very few native species can survive in industrial oil palm monocrops that have low canopies, unstable microclimates, sparse undergrowth, high temperatures, and a toxic mix of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Conserved forest fragments within plantations and at the plantation boundaries are vulnerable to edge effects, whereby the quality of forests deteriorates over time, causing species communities to shift to a simpler composition dominated by a handful of common types. Robbed of their water, nutrients, and symbiotes, plants and animals that once thrived in the forest now wilt and starve. Those who find refuge in marine settlements forget how to hunt and forage independently in the forest. They can no longer reproduce with their own kin and eventually die alone, severed from their families. Meanwhile, sites where meaningful encounters with plants and animals once occurred and that are commemorated by Marind through intergenerationally transmitted songs and stories are replaced by a homogeneous landscape devoid of any referential markers, where everything looks exactly the same no matter how far one walks or in which direction. The skin or surface of the landscape has become flaky, dry, and wizened, and the wetness of watercourses is contaminated with toxic pesticides emanating from oil palm monocrops. In the plantation, then, chemically mediated injustices and harms proliferate across kin and across kind, as well as across time and place, as toxins spread uncontrollably and invisibly across the landscape, condemning the bodies of beings to come to illness and pain through their latent and lethal effects. The ontology or identity of oil palm itself matters to the story of plantation injustice. Oil palm is often described by my companions as a colonizer, an intruder, or an occupier, whose arrival signals the obliteration of the ecologies necessary for marine other than human kin to survive and thrive. In contrast to forest organisms, who have entertained relations of reciprocal care with their human counterparts since time immemorial, oil palm, a recently introduced species in West Papua, is widely characterized by Marind as a destructive and voracious being who does not know how to share place with others and whose relentless proliferation speaks to a kind of insatiable greed. Operating negatively towards all that does not sustain it, oil palm replaces the moral, affective topography of the forest with what Rina Das might call an ecology of fear, one that pervades the everyday life of the human and non-human beings who are being displaced and dispossessed by oil palm's proliferation. One of my companions, Cosmas, an elder from the village of Bayao, captured this violent transformation poignantly in concluding, "In the forest, there was justice for Marind and our plant and animal kin. The laws of the forest ensured that everyone knew how to live well together by feeding each other, caring for each other, and respecting each other. But in the plantation, there is only injustice for Marind and our plant and animal kin. Now it is oil palm who decides the fate of everyone by harming the land, eating the soil, and killing our future." The injustices committed against Marind and their more than human kin as a result of plantation expansion are compounded by injustices stemming from emergent conservation initiatives in Merauke. So in tandem to monocrop development, there's been a range of environmental conservation projects implemented in the region by agribusiness corporations as part of their commitment to responsible or sustainable palm oil production under international certification standards. These standards require that companies identify, demarcate, monitor, and enhance areas that have been classified as high conservation value. These include forests with high concentrations of rare, threatened, or endangered species, and also forest areas that provide critical ecosystemic services in the form of watershed protection and soil erosion control. And yet, despite their purportedly beneficial value in protecting biodiversity, these new conservation zones are a source of widespread consternation frustration, and even sorrow for many of my Marind interlocutors. For starters, what distinguishes a high from a low conservation value zone is unclear to many Marind. Plants and animals, they emphasize, depend upon diverse ecologies that are all equally important to their subsistence, reproduction, and growth, from swamplands, marshlands, and mangroves to savanna, forest, and more. When only certain ecosystems are deemed valuable, those that fall outside this category become sacrifice zones, or areas that are by default assumed to be available for exploitation. Meanwhile, the absence of ecological corridors connecting conservation fragments limits the capacity of organisms to travel the landscape in search of food, water, and mates. While plants and animals are now restricted to these bounded zones of livability, Marind themselves are increasingly excluded from areas where they once hunted, foraged, and fished, as these zones are now strictly out of bounds to everyone but company personnel, conservation scientists, and sustainability auditors. Species that are severed from their relations to humans in the name of environmental conservation are a source of great sadness for Marind. Most notable among these is the sago palm, a plant of central significance in Marind myth and culture, and also the source of their staple starch, sago flour. Sago palms thrive along riverbanks, swamps, and mangroves, environments that are associated by Marind with abundant wetness and fertility. Often described as a tree of many lives, the sago palm also knows how to thrive with myriad organisms, pollinating insects and birds, subterranean microbial communities, and kangaroos and wild pigs, whose droppings help to fertilize the forest soil. Humans too sustain the sago palm through a range of actions, such as pruning stems and stands, clearing dead fronds, weeds, and epiphytes, ring barking the branches, thinning the canopy, and burning excess vegetation. Marind also transplants sago suckers, which helps to enhance their access to water and light, whilst also allowing parent palms to regain their regenerative capacity. In conservation zones, however, Marind cannot care for sago palms, enhance their access to light or nutrients, or make the environment more conducive to healthy growth. Because they cannot transplant the suckers, palms end up reproducing sexually rather than vegetatively. This ends the life cycle of the parent palm, whose seeds disperse across great distances and germinate far away from their kin. Severed from each other, sago seeds and parents become dry, lonely, and sad. Meanwhile, the segregation of sago palms to conservation zones negates the possibility of creating shared memories and relations between humans and plants. Conservation practices in the plantation sector then are very much predicated on the belief that biodiversity protection is best achieved by isolating ecosystems from humans as sources of disturbance. This model, which perpetuates the colonial paradigm of fortress conservation, excludes indigenous communities by conjuring natures worth preserving as pristine zones of wilderness, while simultaneously erasing indigenous place-based and place-making histories. This paradigm ignores the fact that human interactions with ecosystems may in fact enhance biological diversity, whilst also fulfilling the needs of indigenous peoples themselves. It produces injustices because it fails to acknowledge the intrinsic engagement of humans with their environment and the encompassment of other than human life forms within the multi-species society that constitutes nature itself. This then is a sort of eco-imperialism in two shades of green, the green Eden of conservation on the one hand, and the green desert of monocrop plantations on the other. Both of these logics operate through a process of accumulation through double dispossession that deprives communities of their lands and livelihoods. Both also dissect the landscape into bounded zones of production and preservation from which Marind are equally excluded. It comes as little surprise then that for many Marind consider protected areas and agribusiness zones to be nothing less than two sides of the same coin. Questions of injustice in the life world of indigenous Papuans cannot be dissociated from the violent histories and afterlives of colonialism and imperialism. As the Native American Potawatomi scholar Carl Powers White reminds us, climate injustice is a recent episode of a cyclical history of colonialism inflicting anthropogenic environmental change on Indigenous peoples. Climate justice for Indigenous peoples is thus less about the specter of a new future and more like the experience of a déjà vu. Similarly, injustices committed today against Indigenous Marind and their forest kin in the name of capitalist profit and environmental preservation accrue heightened significance in light of the entrenched processes of political colonization, ecological degradation, and ethnic domination that have profoundly shaped the history of West Papua. First colonized by the Dutch in 1882, the western half of the island of New Guinea came under the informal control of Indonesia following the country's independence in 1949. This incorporation was formalized through the controversial Act of Free Choice of 1969, when 1,025 Papuan men and women were handpicked by the Indonesian military and forced to vote in favor of Indonesian control. Meanwhile, Indonesian and foreign corporations plundered natural resources in West Papua in the form of large-scale pulp and paper plantations, timber plantations, and copper and gold mines. Today, bureaucratic red tape and corruption, the oppressive force of the state military corporate troika, and the widespread criminalization of Indigenous individuals suspected of separatist intentions continue to restrict the capacity of Papuans to seek recognition and remedy for the violation of their rights to lands, livelihoods, food, and cultural continuity. The violence of the state perdures in the form of forced incarcerations, physical and psychological harassment, torture, sexual violence against women, and brutal military responses to Indigenous social and political movements. Against this backdrop, then, contemporary plantation expansion in Merauke represents but one of many manifestations of the collective history of suffering experienced by Papuans under Indonesian rule. On the one hand, state rhetoric on the benefits of monocrop expansion often casts the forest-based livelihoods of Marind in a negative light as primitive and backward. At an awareness-raising meeting I attended, for instance, government and industry representatives described oil palm as, I quote, the key to the future of Papua's isolated tribes. The arrival of this, I quote, tree of hope would free Marind from poverty in the forest and enable them to join the world of progress. But at the same time, palm oil expansion is undermining the local food security of Marind as the availability of forest game and plants becomes increasingly limited. Marind are also often denied employment opportunities in the palm oil sector because they are said to be, quote, lazy, uneducated, dirty. These opportunities tend to be given instead to non-Papuan settlers, who are often said by the plantation operators to be more, quote, civilized, hardworking, and hygienic. Much like Papuans are deprived of their right to determine their political futures, oil palm plantation projects in Merauke are largely designed and implemented without the free, prior, or informed consent of Indigenous landowners, and often in the interests of their economic and social advancement into the world of modernity and progress. Consultations, when undertaken, tend to present these projects as a fait accompli, and they offer limited information to communities on the potential risks of the projects for local food security, land rights, and livelihoods. Many Marind have been forced to surrender their lands in the name of national interests and in exchange for derisory compensation. Meanwhile, promises of social welfare, such as education and medical facilities, are rarely fulfilled. In this light, then, monocrop expansion today constitutes the botanical arm of a long-standing process of colonization in which the exploitation of nature goes hand in hand with the dispossession of peoples. In Merauke, oil palm participates in the region's ongoing domination as the state's biological ally, a term that the historian Alfred Crosby uses to describe species that thrive as they travel alongside human colonizers across invaded territories. Like the state, settlers and soldiers taking over Marind lands, oil palm is very much seen by Marind to be foreign, invasive, and destructive. It perpetuates the condition of entrenched inhumanity that Marind and other Papuans are subject to as reluctant citizens of the Indonesian nation state. Amidst these entrenched and emergent regimes of colonialism, capitalism, and conservationism, what possibilities of justice exist for Marind and for their other than human kin? For some Marind, justice takes the form of tangible goods and services that they are owed and yet denied. For instance, local communities should receive from the corporations profiteering from their lands adequate monetary compensation, decent salaries, education opportunities, health facilities, and free access to areas now designated as conservation zones. For other Marind, justice is about due process. Companies should seek the free, prior, and informed consent of landowners before designing and implementing their projects. Communities should also be fully informed of the risks and benefits of these proposed developments. Their customary and collective land tenure systems should be acknowledged, as well as their right to choose their own representatives in land negotiations. Most importantly, the right of communities to say no to ORPAM should at all times be respected. Other Marind, meanwhile, call for justice in restorative and retributive terms. Lands lost under duress or deception should be returned to their owners, along with the crops and structures established upon them. Forest-based modes of subsistence that have been undermined by monocrop conversion should be remedied in the form of alternative livelihoods and access to local and urban markets. Fines should be imposed on corporations that fail to implement their social welfare projects, undermine communities' food and water security, and illegally burn the forest to plant oil palm. And yet, these different forms of justice also come with different conundrums. For some Marind, material goods and restorative measures for communities cannot adequately compensate for the living environments that have already been radically degraded, the vegetation already decimated, the bodies already contaminated, and the species already driven to the brink of extinction. Rather, justice demands a genuine acknowledgement of the devastating effects of plantation expansion on native forest plants, animals, and ecosystems as actors, relations, and kin. This would entail the performance of customary rituals of commemoration, mourning, forgiveness, and redemption towards non-human organisms who also suffer from plantation expansion, as they are encountered and remembered through stories, songs, and myth. In tandem, many Marind have a notion of multi-species justice that calls for a structural move away from top-down environmental practices and instead community-led, bottom-up forms of restoration, management, and conservation that are anchored in traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous science. For other Marind, such forms of grassroots environmental justice are inherently incompatible with the large-scale extractive model of the agro-industrial monocrop. And yet at the same time, many of my companions are acutely aware that rejecting ORPAR projects might make little sense when there are very few alternative opportunities for economic advancement in rural Merauke. The return of lands to local hands, these individuals argue, also comes with the risk of conflict and competition among different clans, because the plants, natural markers, and structures that once demarcated the boundaries of their respective territories have now disappeared. These and other dilemmas over the form and possibility of justice often give rise to tensions and frictions between Marind attracted by the opportunities offered by the oil palm sector and Marind who are staunchly opposed to it. These factions are locally referred to as pro and contra, for and against, but they are neither stable nor bounded. As people struggle to navigate their presence into more livable multi-species futures, they often shift from one vision of justice to another and back. As one of my companions, the elder Pius Basi put it, no one knows for certain what justice might be. No one has the key. Everyone is looking for the right path. And what of oil palm in all of this? As I described earlier, many Marind attribute the destructive effects of agribusiness to the voracious and self-interested nature of oil palm itself. And yet, the idea of punishing oil palm for its destructive actions were largely absent in my companions' discourses and reflections. In part, of course, this is because Marind are aware that there are human actors and forces driving and dictating the particular ways in which oil palm is grown in Merauke and its consequent ecological effects. Indeed, oil palm is often considered an object of pity and compassion among Marind, who contrast its totalizing subjection to human control in monocrops with the freedom of plants and animals in the realm of the forest. For instance, some of my friends would talk about oil palm seeds as, quote, orphans, because their growth and development and eventually death was dictated by humans and happening far away from oil palm's native ecologies. Women expressed sorrow over the fate of oil palm fruit, or what they called oil palm's children, that are ripped away from parent palms during harvesting and then violently flung into overloaded trucks, quote, like corpses. Many other villagers, meanwhile, wondered if oil palm ever felt lonely or sad in the homogeneous environment of the monocrop, where few other species can survive. For Marin, then, knowing the multiple facets of oil palm's world as both a driver of ecological harm and as an object of human exploitation complicates the relationship between justice and punishment. On the one hand, oil palm subverts the species and ecologies that enable Marin to thrive through their relations to non-human beings. And yet oil palm itself is also being robbed of its lively plantiness in the space of the monocrop, where it is separated from its native home, multi-species relations, and capacity to grow autonomously. Marin then are not indifferent to the world of oil palm beyond what they themselves experience in its destructive presence. Rather, they recognize that oil palm is both a subject and an object of injustice. As one of my companions, Marcelina, mused, maybe oil palm too deserves freedom. Maybe oil palm too deserves justice. So the matter of justice in human and more than human terms raises important and troubling questions for Marin over what justice might look like, how it might be achieved, and importantly, who deserves it, both among and beyond humans. To conclude then, in this paper, I have tried to flesh out how processes of mass deforestation and monocrop expansion are radically undermining Marin's intimate and ancestral kinships with sentient forest plants and animals, as well as the moral and ethical principles that undergird their interspecies relatedness. I explored how these transformations are exacerbated by conservation practices that are undertaken in the name of corporate sustainability, but that are problematically premised upon an assumed divide between humans and the environment. I then situated the exclusion of Marin from natures both exploited and preserved within a much longer and ongoing history of violence and dispossession perpetrated against indigenous Papuans under Indonesian rule. Drawing from Marin philosophies, practices, and protocols of more than human relationality, I tried to demonstrate also how Marin conceive and contest the possibility of justice now and in the future, for themselves, for forest organisms, and for oil palm, amidst these multiple, overlapping, and intersecting injustices provoked by capitalism, conservation, and colonialism. These indigenous perspectives, I argue, call for an urgent expansion of the scope and the subjects of justice beyond the human, that nonetheless remain attentive to the violence of capital colonial regimes on indigenous peoples themselves as subjects of entrenched racializing assemblages and top-down developmental paradigms. These indigenous perspectives, I think, call for an intersectional approach to justice. That is to say, a kind of justice that flourishes at the intersections of human social worlds and multi-species social worlds with whom and within humans become. Working at the intersections of multiple different justices, social, racial, environmental, climate, food, intergenerational, and more, thinking about justice from an intersectional perspective calls for a simultaneous engagement of multiple different vantage points from which to engender new ways of seeing, imagining, and being in relation to others and others, by which I mean the other than human. Imagining just futures through this intersectional framework demands that we reconsider what constitutes the threshold of injustice, who gets to determine this threshold, and in whose interest. While the idea of agency often implies fully present, individuated, and autonomous subjects, the framework of intersectionality, I think, points to possibilities of identification amongst differently situated and always entangled beings. And in this, we have much to learn from indigenous peoples, for whom questions of identity, relation of justice, whether desired or imposed, lethal and benign, have always been a multi-species affair. Hacking between justice in human and non-human terms, as Marin taught me to do, further invites an expansion of the concept and practice of justice beyond the here and the now. Other subjects and objects of justice come into play across space and across time. We can think here of the myriad organisms whose past lives and labors have shaped and are inscribed in the disappearing ecologies of the Upper Bian region. We can think of the global community of consumers who rely daily on the palm oil produced from marine lands as food, as ingredient, as biofuel, as source of income, and more. We can think about justice through the slow, latent violence of toxic pesticides, fertilizers, and haze on human environmental health across place, species, and generations. Working through the complex poetics and politics of these more than human temporal and spatial entanglements requires, importantly, that we untether justice from its human-centric and individualistic premises, and instead perhaps approach relations themselves across life forms as the subject of justice, from intimate relations of care and kinship to violent relations of exploitation, extraction, and extinction. Grappling with justice in human and other human terms is, of course, no easy task. It may open new forms of hope and empowerment for some, while foreclosing these avenues for others. It involves traveling a path, to return to my companion Pius's words, towards shared and livable futures, a path that is always already traveled alongside companions, both loving and unloving, and familiar and unexpected. As the anthropologist Naisar Gidave has argued, the concept of justice very acutely comes to the fore precisely when justice is absent. Justice in this light can be defined as a lack or absence of a form of violence or harm, not being removed from one's land, not being subjected to racialized treatment, or not being forcefully separated from the other than human beings and ecologies that are constitutive to one's being, becoming, and belonging. Perhaps then one of the qualities of justice is that even if, or precisely because it is never quite here, it is also never completely impossible. Despite their ongoing dispossession and disempowerment, Marin today insist on imagining a field of justice where multiple species circulate cradle to cradle, where the oikos of the household is in dynamic equilibrium with interlocking ecological systems. Within this field, justice is always slippery and spectral. It shifts and morphs across space, time, and species, often resisting institutional capture or human mastery. Justice exerts an unpredictable force in the world as actuality or potentiality through momentous events, everyday moments, and provisional judgments. And even in the ruin and the rubble of the plantation scene, multi-species patches of vegetation remain precious refuges of practice, growth, and memory for marined men, women, and children who insist they will continue to visit the forest so long as the forest is still standing. In this space, walking, knowing, remembering, and celebrating the sentient ecologies are in themselves forms of justice making and world making. Walking the forest is an act at once modest and resilient, poetic and political. It embodies an active and collective mode of reckoning, refusal, and resistance. By walking the forest, knowing and remembering and celebrating it, Marin produced a patchwork of little justices enacted by peoples historically marginalized within hegemonic architectures of injustice that continue to be monopolized by colonial and capitalist regimes. These little justices subvert the reductionist and homogenizing logic of the plantation and scenic epoch. They draw in human and other than human worlds through shared walking, planting, singing, weeping, storing, fighting, and more. And they continue to sprout from the soil, enduring even as the soil is exhausted and dying. In an allied spirit, then, we might become interested in patches of justice amidst uneven conditions of livability in the Anthropocene. Intersectionality, at the end of the day, points to the hopeful edge of interspecies political projects, where new articulations might produce new grounds for potential flourishing. What Marin taught me is that it is possible to care for particular forms of life and biocultural communities, whilst at the same time holding on to promises of sweeping change on future horizons. Marin offers us an approach to multi-species justice that is anchored in this ongoing practice of being open and alive to the generative possibilities of each interspecies encounter, be it lively or lethal, or desired or imposed. This approach demands perhaps that we decide, as citizens of this waning planet, which dreams of justice are worth dreaming, and by extension, which injustices we deem intolerable, disproportional, or incommensurable. This then is an approach or an invitation to renew our commitment to love, to live, and to fight for the possibility of flourishing in multi-species worlds, both present and yet to come. Thank you.
Very, very impressive, Dr. Sufi, and very well represented the marine community. In fact, I have heard a lot about the devastation caused by oil palm plantation, but I would rather buy your story because there is no doubt about the credibility of your research, as I've already mentioned. And having said that, I want you to bring your attention to India. I'm not sure whether you are following this news, but recently in India, the Union Government of Agriculture has proposed a massive project in some parts of India, particularly in the Northeast, where a lot of indigenous people and tribal community inhabit. So this massive palm plantation, listening to the horrifying stories that you have brought about in the case of marine, as a researcher and as a concerned citizen, I'm deeply troubled. And I wanted to start this discussion by asking you two questions. The first is, on the basis of your research among the marine community, how has oil palm plantation changed in the recent years, say 3 to 5 years, and how do you see it in the coming years if this trend continues? And the second, if there is any organization within the community and out of the community working or making an effort to tackle this issue. If there is, then how are they doing so? And as you respond to this, I will ask Professor Lucy to follow up and take the discussion forward.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I really appreciate Sophie's presentation and also your sharing of your research work. I have maybe the time is limited, so I will raise perhaps some issues and also maybe basically raise some question and then share some of my observation. I hope it will be helpful to all of us. As Longshi Benny has said, this palm oil plantation has also been debated here in Meghalaya, Shillong. Okay, the government is proactive, and the people hearing the work like your work, around the world and in India, there are some reservation, and I believe we should always discuss. I think that is the key. So coming just few points that I would like to place before us this morning is, of course, thank you, Longshi, and your department for inviting me. It is so good to see your own student, standing there, and I'm so proud. It's like a mother so proud of a daughter. Okay, so keep it up. I hope the department appreciate what a gem you are, and all the best. Okay, anyway, the first issue, what Sophie has highlighted, oil plantation as subject and object of injustice. Now here, what I would like you to focus, this is what I see, monocrop and multi-crop. Now for me, you need to look at the symbolism of this monocrop and multi-crop, because monocrop seems to symbolize a kind of a self-interest, a kind of a selfish aspect, So I think this aspect, perhaps we can look at the symbolic aspect, because anthropology basically focuses on that. Now, the other issue is basically that I would like to raise here is to do with in relation to conceptual issues. Now, you use the term colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, okay? What about socialism? Have you looked at that aspect, the pros and cons? This perhaps may give us, kind of a more broader perspective. That's what, I feel. Now, coming to your approaches, you have basically used the approach of framework of intersectionality. Now, my question to you is, what are its limitations? It's a kind of, from reading your article, your paper and also listening to you, I find perhaps you are romanticizing the approach or framework. It has its limitation. Are you conscious of that limitation? Because I think no approach or method is foolproof. So we as scholars need to be aware of this, limitation and strength. Now, I am basically interested to know, also the limitation. Though you have highlighted all the strength, I think many scholars, scholars, budding scholars are listening to your presentation. And since you are into it for so many years with your experience, with due respect to you, I have no really knowledge into all this, but this is my, observation from afar. So, this I think needs to be discussed. Now, I totally agree with you that much has to be learned from indigenous people. Their experiences, which you have beautifully brought out. I would like also you to highlight on what are the factors which empower them and disempower them. So I think these issues also need to be looked at. Now, the other important aspect for me is what is the role of indigenous scholars? You have talked about relationship between people and land, between you and the people. But are they local? I mean, are they indigenous scholars, local scholars? If they don't have indigenous scholars, are there provision, scope that some could be trained into this whole process of looking into their whole society in terms of justice? It's very important. We cannot impose, we can help them perhaps see issues around them. Now, since I'm coming from Meghalaya and where the government is trying to really, push this plantation, and the debate is so much in the newspaper, only newspaper clipping that I read. I think another important factor perhaps for us in India is the issue of statecraft. The state deciding to advocate palm oil plantation as a key to the future of the state. I find that perhaps after listening to your, presentation, is this a modern paternalistic attitude? People are protesting, but the government says it has to for the future of the state, modern state. So I think perhaps these are, some of the question I have before you. There are lots, but I think perhaps we can stick to this. Last but not the least is, what do you think are the coping mechanism that people are applying today? I'm very curious to know that. That would be my last point. Okay, so back to you, Sophia. You can just, kind of travel through the thoughts that I have thrown to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lucy, for this incredible ecology of questions. I will try to do them justice in the time that I have. And thank you also, Longshibeni, for your two earlier questions, and I will try to weave into my response. So the question of, I'll start with Longshibeni's questions, perhaps, the question of the impacts of these developments in the last few years. So these projects are relatively new, actually. It's only been about, a decade or so since oil palm was introduced. And what we've seen on the ground and what has been documented by local NGOs has been a whole range of, adverse effects on local food security, on the health of communities, often as a result of chemical contamination from the plantations. And then, a whole range of other impacts related to fragmentation and horizontal conflict among communities themselves, right? And perhaps here I'm nodding to the risk of romanticization that you touched on, Professor Zehal. You know, many communities are very split, right? Those who are for, those who are against oil palm. One of the greatest factors that is disempowering Marind is precisely that, right? And there's a very strong gendered dimension to that fragmentation. Why so? You know, Marind, it's often the men who are involved in decision-making processes and consultations with the state, with the corporations, and many women who see themselves and pride themselves as being mothers and nurturers and carers, express a lot of frustration and resentment. I would also say anger towards the men who are, you know, collaborating or working with state and corporate you know, entities in ways that disregard the long-term effects of land-based decisions today. So that's you know, a serious consequence, I think, of these top-down development projects. There's been a lot of grassroots advocacy, campaigning, lobbying to sort of curb or counter oil palm expansion in Merauke. Some of this had been at the local level in the form of protests, you know, blockades of plantation entry points, demonstrations. There's also been national petitions and court cases raised at the national and regional levels. And then there's also been international level advocacy in the form of complaints and submissions raised, for instance, in the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Unfortunately, you know, these various levels of advocacy have had very little real impact on the ground, and a big reason for that is the settler colonial context that we're talking about, right? So what often happens in Papua is that from the moment that communities talk about rights, even if it's, you know, right to land or right to food or right to water, they very often get slotted into the separatist box, right? Right is interpreted as the right to self-determination in a political jurisdictional sense, right? Whereas in fact, a lot of the time, Papuans are talking about very immediate, everyday urgencies and necessities that, you know, feeding their kids, you know, walking the forest, sustaining their stories and songs and so forth, right? But the political context here makes any sort of invocation of rights very problematic and very sensitive, right? Because of that sort of context of forced incorporation. Statecraft and paternalistic modernity, I think, Professor Lucy, you are hitting very much the core of so much of the rhetoric that surrounds oil palm development, right? It is seen as for the greater good of the nation. It's also often described as for the greater good of the planet, so feeding the world, right? Of producing commodities to feed a global and growing population. So there's national and international sort of logics of production that are at play there. But I would absolutely say that in a place like Papua, where indigenous peoples are so often, you know, characterized as backward and primitive because they depend on the forest for their livelihoods, the sort of framing of oil palm as the tree of hope, as is often, you know, said in official discourse, is really at the heart of what's going on here. Symbolism. It's a fantastic question, and I think I'm so glad that you're you know, inviting me to flesh out a bit more this multi-crop and monocrop distinction, because you're right, it's central to the way in which Marind characterize oil palm, because it is, on the one hand, a destructive crop that is taking over their lands, but it's also itself a victim or an object of institutional and technological and genetic manipulation, right? So it's both victim and driver, which I always found, it's a very, I would say, quite a nuanced way of thinking about cash crops, right? Certainly for me, who came in thinking about plantations as, you know, a commodity, problematic commodity, it added a lot of nuance to that characterization. And I think the symbolism here is again indissociable from the political and historical context, right? And it's literally in the materiality of the plantation. So many Marind, for instance, compare the plantation to a military regiment. Why? Because if you look at a plantation, it's equidistant, identical trees, standing straight, that very much resemble a formation of soldiers, right, in a procession or in a march. So there are direct visual analogy that they make between the plantation form and the military form. And that symbolic indexicality is all the more significant because the military is a big player in the palm oil sector. The military, acts as the security guards who patrol the plantation. They are the ones who keep people out of the plantation conservation zones. They are often shareholders or investors in these plantations, right? So that military agribusiness state troika is manifest materially and also symbolically in the plantation formation. Indigenous scholarship, again, a really important question. The book that I've been writing and that's coming out next year very much engages in problematizing with this question of decolonial research methodologies. And in part, of course, that involves bringing in and being in conversation with Indigenous scholars and scholarship from Papua, but also the Pacific writ large. There are significant, pan-regional, cultural continuities and creative theorizing that I very much engage with. But of course, it brings in all kinds of other questions about my own positionality as a non-Indigenous researcher whose scholarship is enabled by deeply colonial infrastructures like the university, right? What I found most generative, I think, has been to not only be in conversation with Indigenous scholars and scholarship in trying to do justice to Marin ways of theorizing their changing worlds, but to bring, Western theory to the field with me, right? So translating Derrida and Caraway, bringing these texts to Papua and actually discussing them, debating them, deliberating them with Marin, who are perfectly capable of theorizing, being ontologists of their own changing world. But what I've been interested in is that sort of cross-pollination, right? To bring different ways of theorizing into conversation with one another. And a big part of what came out of that was that a lot of what is now being framed as postmodernism or posthumanism or multi-species studies are ways of thinking, and more than that, ways of being that have always been central to Indigenous, ways of being in the world, right? Just framed in different sorts of jargons. So that then brings up some really interesting and I think tricky but important questions about decolonizing the stories that I try to tell that are so much about colonization. And I've got 1 more minute, so I just want to quickly say one more thing about the conceptual framework and socialism. You're right, it's a question I get asked a lot. This relationship between capitalism, socialism, colonialism. It's one that I'm afraid I haven't given enough thought to, but that I know I need to. What I think has come out to me strongly is that outside of the isms that we're talking about, there's fundamentally a sort of a logic of mastery, control, domination, and discipline at the heart of the plantation that perhaps transcends the isms, right? And maybe that's what we need to be looking at, that the ways in which that logic of mastery, of domination is generative of forms of extraction and extinction and emergence also that work across different political and ideological systems, right? So that's as far as I can go in response to that question, but thank you for inviting me to do my homework.
Okay, thank you. That's fine. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie, for your response. I would love to follow up, but unfortunately we are bound by time and I have to close this session. And also thank you very much, Professor Lucy. A lot of concerns that you have raised, I'm sure it has been representative to a lot of participants who are joining us YouTube live right now. Thank you very much for that. And as I always say, this is just an end of a session and not the end of discussion and deliberation. I think that should continue. And we would love to keep in touch with both our speakers and discussants, keeping up with your work. And we really hope to meet you both in person sometime next year. So thank you very much for your presence and for making this session really, really fruitful. We hope you will be in a position to join us a technical session, which we are going to go live in some time from now. So with this note, big thank you once again. And a thank you note to all our participants who are also joining us YouTube live. Thank you very much and have a very great day ahead. Thank you.